Erin Gless is the Executive Director for the Pacific Whale Watch Association. Excuse me. She holds a BS in Biology, Marine emphasis from Western Washington University and dual bachelor's degrees in Public Relations and Spanish from the University of Miami. She has been part of the whale watching community since 2008 and has worked as an onboard naturalist in both Southern California and the Salish Sea. In addition to her work with the Pacific Whale Watch Association, Erin also volunteers with happywhale.com to document humpback whale social relationships and with Cascadia Research Collective to catalog Hawaiian spotted dolphins. Erin currently resides in Anacortes, Washington, and in her spare time can be found hiking, kayaking, and of course, whale watching. Erin, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I will let you take it away from here.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you so much. I am going to switch over and share my screen here. All right, there we go. All right. And you said we are recording, correct? We're good to go? Okay. So I will first preface by saying that there are some people in the audience today who have been studying killer whales for longer than I have been alive. So it's a bit of an intimidating audience, but I'm going to do my very, very best here today to give an overview of the killer whales that we have here in the Salish Sea. Again, as you mentioned, I know some folks are just kind of trickling in. Just keep your mics on mute, and then we'll have lots of questions at the end, hopefully. But without further ado, let's talk a little bit about the killer whales of the Salish Sea. And when we're talking about killer whales, this is the animal that we are talking about. These are killer whales, scientific name, Orcinus orca. And before I go any further into this talk, I have been in this business for quite a while. I know that this is a heated debate. Killer whales, orcas here in the Salish Sea, I know there's a lot of contention about what to call them. Killer whales is kind of what the scientific literature favors. That's original. It came from killer of whales, Ballenas asesinas, because they hunt other types of whales. There was a movement to switch it to the species name, Orcinus orca. So up here, a lot of folks favor that. I know there's people that feel that killer whale portrays them as being these mindless killers. But the truth is they're really effective predators. Even those fish-eating southern residents kill harbor porpoise, and they don't even eat them. They just kill them for sport. So I think killer whale is appropriate. Other folks get upset because they think that they are dolphins and not whales and shouldn't be called killer whales. They are technically both. So they are the largest of the oceanic dolphins, but dolphins are a type of toothed whale, an odontocete, and so they're all correct. So tomato, I'll probably use the terms interchangeably this evening, but you can call them killer whales, you can call them orcas, they are both correct. Okay, so back to the basics. So killer whales or orcas, as far as length goes, this varies a little bit depending on the type of orca that we're talking about, but up to about 27 feet is some of the largest that we have in this area. And up to about 25,000 pounds for some of the large males. For orcas, the males do get considerably larger than the females. They're what we call a sexually dimorphic species. The males look very different than the females. It's the males that have those huge 6-foot dorsal fins. Females have a much smaller fin. As far as lifespan goes, they're very long-lived. We think that the females can live to be about 80 to 90 years old. We do have some very elderly females swimming around the Salish Sea currently. And then for males, they don't live quite as long, and we'll talk about that later. But about 30 to 50 years would be an expected lifespan for males. We do have some males that are older than that in our bigs or transient population currently. And then diet, varied. As I mentioned, there are a couple of different types of orcas, and depending on the type you're talking about, they have very different prey items that they specialize on. And so we'll talk a bit about that, but combined, they'll really eat just about anything. They just tend to specialize depending on where they live. This is a fantastic illustration that was done by Uko Gorder showing some of the ecotypes. That's kind of the fancy term that we use for these many different types of killer whales around the world. As of right now, all the same species, so all Orcinus orca. But if you look at this graphic, you can see that they look quite different from each other. You have some that are in the southern hemisphere that are quite small. Some have really, really tiny eye patches. In the northern hemisphere, the saddle patches and dorsal fins can vary quite a bit. If you look at their DNA is different. Many of these types of killer whales branched off hundreds of thousands of years from each other. They don't breed with each other. For all intents and purposes, they really act like different species, many of them, but haven't pulled the trigger yet. The scientific community hasn't opened that can of worms. And so for now, they are all the same species, Orcinus orca. Here in the Salish Sea, and when I refer to the Salish Sea, I'm talking about these connected waterways over here on the left-hand side, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Puget Sound, Strait of Georgia, all of these waterways near the San Juan Islands. That is the collective name for the Salish Sea waters where these whales live. And there's really three possible ecotypes that we could encounter here. Realistically, there's two, but we do every now and then get visits from a third ecotype. And so I figured it was worth mentioning here this evening. But those are the resident killer whales, the bigs, sometimes known as transient killer whales, and then the offshore killer whales. And let's start with the type that we are least likely to encounter here in the Salish Sea, which are the offshore killer whales. This is a great photo that came from a friend of mine who owns a whale watch company down in Monterey Bay, California, from an encounter they had last year with offshore killer whales. Offshore killer whales are the smallest of the North Pacific ecotypes. So they really get to be about 20 feet, maybe 21 feet for the males in length. And they tend to travel in large groups, so dozens of whales at a time. There are reports of 50, 60, 90 of these offshore orcas all traveling together. And we know that they range from Alaska all the way down to Southern California. They have huge ranges and can cover a lot of distance in a short amount of time. Sightings here in the Salish Sea are incredibly rare. I personally have never seen them in my work in San Diego or here in the Salish Sea. And I believe the last sighting of them in these inland waters was in 2002, so 20 years ago. So very, very rare, but possible. We had a beluga in Puget Sound last year, so anything's possible. So it's definitely worth mentioning our offshore killer whales. As far as their population goes, we believe there's about 300 animals. These whales are kind of mysterious, so we're still learning quite a bit about them, but about 300 animals or so. And as far as their physical characteristics, they're known for what we call a faint saddle. So behind the dorsal fin is this little patch we call a saddle patch. And in the case of offshore killer whales, it's not as bright white as some other types of orcas, kind of faded. Dorsal fin is usually a little bit more rounded at the top. And offshore, they're leading a rough and tumble life. So they tend to have some nicks and cuts in that dorsal fin to help identify individuals. Very little is known about offshore killer whale behavior. I believe there's been about 200 or less sightings ever since we knew that they existed, right? So we don't know a lot about where they go. They've done some satellite tagging recently. A paper just came out. I haven't had time to dive into it yet, but we know that they're moving really long distances. We do know that they feed on a variety of fish, but they favor sharks, which is really cool. This is a great image from Slater Moore Photography, again, down in California, of some offshore killer whales eating what they reported to be a 7-gill shark. So you can see this from their drone footage. On the right, I just thought this was funny. A lot of folks associate, great whites as being the top oceanic predators. But the truth is, in places like California, on at least one occasion, and in South Africa, where they have some orcas there that feed on great white sharks. So it is truly orcas that are at the top of the food chain. They are the real jaws in the ocean. Now, there is a consequence to feeding on sharks, and it has to do with their teeth. So sharks have skin that's almost like a plate of armor. If you look at this microscope image of their shark skin that's been blown up, they're called dermal denticles. They're these little almost plates of armor. And when these offshore killer whales are feeding on sharks, it's like munching on sandpaper. Their teeth get worn down over time. If you look at the top here, these are some teeth that belonged to an offshore orca that washed up, and you can see that they're filed down nearly flat. If you look to the right-hand side, you'll see on the top is a deceased resident or salmon-eating orca. In the middle is a transient or Biggs orca that feeds on marine mammals, and at the bottom are the teeth of an offshore orca that feeds on sharks. And you can see that those those teeth are almost completely worn down because of that rough skin of the sharks. So they have done some prey sampling as well, stomach contents work, and have found sharks in them. So we do know that they are feeding on sharks, but the tooth wear is just an extra support of that. Next, I want to talk about Biggs, formerly known as transient killer whales. This is the type of killer whale, unlike the offshores, that we are actually most likely to see in the Salish Sea in 2022. And they are the largest of the North Pacific killer whale ecotypes. The largest male that we have in this population currently measured about 27 feet in length based on drone measurements. And they typically travel in smaller groups, about 4 to 6 animals. And now I put an asterisk next to that because we are noticing that that's starting to change. So they used to travel in those small groups, but as the population grows in this area, they're kind of coming together for these larger social gatherings. And it's not uncommon to see groups of, 10, 12, 20. I believe so far this year, we had a group of 25 Biggs killer whales all together. And so you can't use just group size to identify them. Their range is from Southeast Alaska to Central California. And it's not just that you can find this type of killer whale in that range. Those animals themselves swim from, Southeast Alaska down to Central California, stopping along the way. So they really do cover large distances. As far as their physical characteristics, their saddle patch is a lot more defined. It's a lot brighter white, and it's what we call a closed saddle. When we get to the residents next, you'll see what it looks like to have an open saddle. And their dorsal fins tend to be really quite pointy, unlike the rounded top, like that we mentioned with the offshores. And they do also tend to have a lot of nicks and cuts in their dorsal fins, which can make identifying them really quite easy. Biggs killer whales are apex predators. They feed on other marine mammals, things like seals, sea lions, harbor porpoise. You can see a very unfortunate harbor porpoise in this photo with a Biggs killer whale in the middle of a hunt, as well as other whales. We've seen them here in this region, kind of getting into skirmishes with gray whales and humpback whales. No confirmed attack on those types of whales, but we have seen them confirmed to kill minke whales in this area, which is a smaller baleen whale, about the same size as an orca. So they will eat pretty much any of the marine mammals that we have in this area. And we do have quite a lot of marine mammals in this area. And because there is a steady food supply of those seals and sea lions and porpoises that are doing well, the Biggs population is also doing quite well. They're booming. Right now, there's about 370 animals in this population, give or take, and they're increasing at more than 4% per year. Last year alone, in 2021, there were 11 new calves reported. And I can tell you already for 2022, there have been 6 new calves documented to this population. So they're just growing like gangbusters. And again, it really has to do with having that very stable, reliable source of food. One of the things that we really try to do with the Pacific Whale Watch Association as far as outreach goes is stress to boaters that Biggs killer whales can be seen just about anywhere at any time of year. If you look at this map on the right, these are our 2021 Biggs killer whale sightings. And as you can see, if there's a marine waterway that's accessible, there's probably a Biggs killer whale in it at some point during the year. They're out there looking for, porpoises, seals, sea lions that are close to shore. And pretty much as long as they can get there, they can access those waterways to feed. So you'll see them all the way down into some of those narrow waterways down near Olympia. And I had to cut the map off to fit, but they go all the way up through the top of the Salish Sea for sure. And it's important to raise that awareness because many boaters, especially those that grew up here, Biggs killer whales are a relatively new phenomenon. We've only been seeing them in the numbers and frequency that we have been in the last 5 or 6 years. And so letting boaters know that these whales are here, unlike the southern residents who have been kind of advertised as being summer whales. Biggs killer whales can show up at any time. And we really just want to make sure that boaters know that so that they're looking out for them and know to behave appropriately. And then resident killer whales. This is really the focus of Orca Action Month. And so I want to spend the bulk of our talk this evening on our residents. Now, resident killer whales are smaller than Biggs killer whales, but larger than offshore. So they're kind of right in the middle. And they typically travel in larger groups. So maybe, 20 or so whales, but again, an asterisk. In the last few years, their behavior has changed as they're looking for food in different places and there's a scarcity of that salmon that they need. They've been kind of fracturing off into smaller groups. There's a group L12 that just spent the last couple of days here. That's only 6 whales. So, if you come across a group of 6 whales, it could be Biggs, it could be residents, you never know. So again, group size is not the best way to determine the identity of an ecotype. Resident killer whales, they feed on a variety of fish. They really prefer salmon, especially Chinook salmon. Chinook salmon are the fattiest of our local salmon. And their physical characteristics, I mentioned that the Biggs killer whales have what we call a closed saddle. Many residents have what we call an open saddle. So if you look at this image of the female here on the right, you can see that the saddle has kind of this whorl in the middle, that dark patch. It's not a solid white patch like we see on the Biggs a lot of the time. And then unlike the pointy dorsal of the Biggs killer whales, the residents tend to have a more rounded dorsal fin. And also, unlike the offshores and the Biggs killer whales who tend to have a lot of nicks and cuts in the fin, they usually have a pretty smooth and clean dorsal fin. There's a couple in the population that have a little nick or two, but for the most part, there's not as much damage to their dorsal fins. Now, there are also residents in Alaska. There's Alaskan resident population, but as far as the types of resident killer whales we could see in the Salish Sea, there are 2. There's northern residents, and if you look at the map here, you'll see their range. They are, as their name implies, found in kind of the northern portion of this region. Their population is doing fairly well. There's about 310 animals as of their last official count. And they're seen really only occasionally in the Salish Sea. They'll make their way down usually a couple times a year. I think there were 3 days last year that they were seen off of Vancouver. So it's not common, but again, it's a possibility. So it's good to know. It is southern residents that are really the focus of so many of the conservation efforts that we have in this area. Again, looking at the map, you can see their range, and they inhabit the southern kind of half of the resident populations. They can be found all the way down south towards Monterey Bay, California, believe it or not. So resident is kind of a misleading term. It implies that they're living here in the Salish Sea all the time, but they're really residents of the areas between Monterey Bay and, Southeast Alaska. They've even been documented in. So they move around quite a bit, can cover about 100 miles in a 24-hour period of time. Now, for many decades, and honestly, probably centuries and centuries, they were the most commonly seen whales here in the Salish Sea, but that is definitely changing. This is a great graphic that was put together by Orca Behavior Institute that kind of shows that shift. So for many, many years, professional whale watchers watched southern resident killer whales pretty much exclusively. You know, a couple decades ago, we didn't have humpback whales here. We weren't seeing gray whales here. It was really the southern residents that built this industry. And then as the population of seals and sea lions in this area started to rebound, those big killer whales started to show up more and more. And back in 2015, 2016, bigs and the residents were here about the same number of days. And then you can see starting in 2017, there was a huge shift. Southern residents started spending much less time here, and bigs killer whales just moved in and started spending a lot more time here. Last year was a record as far as bigs killer whales go in how frequently we saw them. They were here at least 90% of the year, 329 days that they were reported. And that's just the days that they were reported. You know, on a bad weather day when there's no boats out and there's nobody on shore to look, it probably just means that there was nobody out there to see the whales. I wouldn't be surprised if you told me that there were bigs killer whales somewhere in the Salish Sea every single day. Conversely, southern residents were here the fewest number of days they've ever been recorded, which is really sad, 103 days or 28% of the year. So that was a record low. So it really is a tale of two killer whales. The bigs are doing very well as far as population goes. They're also here very often. Southern residents not doing as well and spending a lot more time elsewhere looking for food. Here is a graph from Center for Whale Research about the population. You can see that their population was listed as endangered in 2005, but they have failed to recover since that listing. And so despite many, many conservation efforts, their numbers continue to decline. And that's what inspired, first it was Orca Month, Orca Awareness Month, and now it's really Orca Action Month, because we really want to try to light a fire under folks to get them to do something to help these animals. Currently, in 2020, the estimated population was 74. Now, 2 years later, it's still estimated at 74. There have been a couple of births since then. There's 2 new babies that we're excited about, J59, who's the youngest J-pod baby, and then a new baby was seen with K-pod twice off of Oregon. It's yet to be here, so we're kind of holding off on confirmation of that, but possibly 2 calves in the southern resident population, but they also lost a few individuals. So we're still at 74 animals as of right now is the estimate. So how do we get here? Why are offshores and northern residents and bigs killer whales doing fairly well and southern residents not doing well in comparison? And it's a very complicated issue, but we have to start with something that a lot of folks don't like to talk about because it's a dark spot on our history when it comes to whales in the Salish Sea, but it absolutely played a big part in why the southern residents are struggling so much currently. And those are the captures, the live capture era. So for those that aren't familiar, I won't go into this too much, but the very first orca to be captured was nicknamed Moby Doll back in 1964 by the Vancouver Aquarium in this area. And the intent was actually never to capture a whale for an aquarium to be on display. They went out with the mission of killing a whale so that they could prepare it and display it at their facility. But the whale, after being harpooned, didn't pass away and they felt bad. And so they brought it to Vancouver, put it in a pen, and that whale unfortunately only lived for a few months, but in those few months that it was there, it drew so many crowds that, the aquarium wanted more. Other aquariums around North America wanted their own killer whale on display. And throughout the 60s and really the first half of the 70s, nearly 50 southern residents and about 20 other killer whales were taken to aquariums. And on top of those animals that were physically taken, several other whales died during the process. And this image is really tough to see because, it's hard to think that we did that to these animals that we're now working so hard to save, but we did. And again, it's a huge reason of why they are where they are today. If you look at this population again, we really don't have an accurate number of how many southern residents there were before the captures because we weren't studying them back then. You know, it wasn't until the mid 70s that folks started researching these whales. But we know how many approximately were taken for aquariums. And so you can see that steep drop in the 60s and 70s. And based on that, we think there were probably about 100 or so before then. You know, we're not talking about a population of 500 or 1,000 that I sometimes hear folks say. It was probably a relatively small population, but certainly probably at least 100. But so steep drop, and they've gone up and down in recent years as high as 98 in the late 90s, but just have not really been able to get over that hump and recover. And again, now we're down to just 74. And so right now, as far as current threats go, there's pretty much unanimous support that the number one reason these whales are not thriving is prey availability. They just don't have a reliable source of prey throughout the entire year to keep them fed. This is a great image from SR3 taken with a drone. You can see a southern resident killer whale chasing a salmon in this photo. Take note of the size of that salmon. So I'm going to show a picture here next to kind of compare. So this is southern resident killer whale currently chasing salmon. And over on the left is another salmon. So there's two things going on with salmon right now. One is that just in general, the number of salmon out there has been decreasing for decades. If you look at this graph down at the bottom, again, just like the southern resident killer whale population, it's gone up and down, it's fluctuated, but the general trend is decreasing. And that is due to loss of habitat, it's due to warming oceans, it's due to, you know, their prey being affected, it's due to bycatch. There's so many things that are impacting salmon populations. There's no one silver bullet. If there were, we would have fixed this problem already. But salmon in general, just not doing as well as it really needs to be doing to sustain southern resident killer whales. The other half of this problem is that not only are there fewer salmon, but the salmon that are out there are much smaller than they used to be. And so this is a salmon from many decades ago. They used to be, you know, 50 pounds, 60 pounds. There are reports of salmon weighing more than 100 pounds. Those are the salmon that southern resident killer whales used to catch here in the region. And now the average size of a Chinook salmon is between 10 and 30 pounds. And so what you have happening is that these whales need to consume the same number of calories every day to stay alive. But because the fish are so much smaller, they have to eat a lot more of those fish to get the same number of calories, but they're expending a lot of calories to catch all those fish. Whereas, you know, if they were chasing big salmon like these, they might only have to catch 2 or 3 a day, right? It just came out a few hours ago. I haven't read the paper, but I was reading the press release. Some students from University of British Columbia came out with a study, and they found that over the last few years, southern residents have been burning about 17% more calories than they're consuming. So they're just not getting that return on investment that they need to be able to put on weight. This is another really fantastic illustration. This was put together by Jane Kogan last year in conjunction with the Center for Whale Research. It's a bit complicated, but just to explain the gist, basically all these colorful lines down at the bottom are salmon numbers in various rivers along the West Coast. And so they compile them on top of each other to kind of give you an idea of the total salmon available. And then up on the top, these purple bars are southern resident killer whale deaths. And so if you don't see a bar at all, that's a year where we were fortunate and no southern residents passed away. If you see a very large bar, that's a year where 5, 6, 7 southern residents passed away that year. And it's pretty obvious when you compare them to the salmon numbers that in years that there are a lot of salmon, there are very few deaths. And in years where there are not very many salmon, there are a lot of southern resident killer whale deaths. And again, for anyone that doubts that salmon are essential to southern resident killer whale health, these are the types of figures that we really hope people see, because it's just so obvious to see how linked they are to each other. So that's the food aspect. And of course, that is what we really want to see prioritized. But there are some other exacerbating threats that are also harming or at least hurting southern resident killer whale chances of recovery. One of them is pollution or exposure to contaminants. So this is a kind of nice figure here on the left that shows how these contaminants accumulate in the food web. So you have chemicals getting into the system, they're being absorbed by phytoplankton, which gets eaten by zooplankton, which gets eaten by little fish, which get eaten by bigger fish like salmon, which eventually get eaten by big whales like our southern resident killer whales. And so all of those toxicants are accumulating in their body, and many of them are fat soluble, which means they're stored in the whale's blubber. And those are accumulating over time. Females can actually offload some of those contaminants. It's not exactly ideal because the way they offload those contaminants is by passing them on to their babies when they give birth, both when they're actually giving birth to the calf as well as when they're nursing that calf. This is really problematic because the firstborn to a mom tends to have the highest load of toxins because she's basically getting all of those contaminants that her mom had throughout her life passed to her. And so if you look at the mortality rate of firstborn calves or calves that were born after a very long kind of period between births with moms, that mortality rate is much higher. But females technically do have a way to offload those and pass them on to their offspring through nursing and giving birth. Males have no way to do that. They're not giving birth to calves and they're not nursing. And so males have a much higher load in their system. And I mentioned at the start that the males do not live nearly as long as the females. This could certainly be a reason why. Now, what's really important to know is that these toxicants that are stored in the fat get metabolized when the whales burn that fat. So if you are a skinny whale that doesn't have, the luxury of not dipping into your fat stores, you're going to be metabolizing those toxicants regularly. Big killer whales, on the other hand, they're actually even higher up on the food chain. They have even more contaminants in their system, but they are eating so much food. I mean, if you look at them compared to southern residents, they're just so chunky, they're huge. They're not dipping into those fat stores like the southern residents are. So they might have lots and lots of contaminants in their system, but they're not breaking them down because they're not dipping into their fat. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. It ties back to food being an essential problem. And then kind of the final of the big three threats, we have prey availability, we have contaminants, and then we have disturbance. This is a very powerful photograph taken by Alan Niles, and it shows a southern resident killer whale in the Strait of Juan de Fuca directly in front of a container ship, which we have quite a lot of in this area. We have the busy parts of Vancouver and Seattle, and so we see these ships and whales interact all the time. Disturbance, as far as how it affects the whales, southern residents specifically, it affects them due to their echolocation. So they're hunting and navigating using echolocation. Basically, they send out these signals, these clicks, and if there's a salmon in their path, it'll bounce off the salmon. The whales pick that signal back up in their jaw, and that's how they know the salmon is there. When there are lots and lots of salmon in the area, it's not so hard to find them. If there's only a few salmon in the area, it becomes really difficult for the whales to find them, and that's why this disturbance becomes more of an issue. As far as the sound being generated by vessels, when a propeller turns, for example, those little bubbles that are generated, when they pop, that's what's making the majority of the noise. We call it cavitation. So yes, the engine itself makes some noise, the machinery in the vessel, but it's really those cavitation bubbles, those little popping bubbles from the propeller. When they pop, that's what's generating the majority of the sound. And so studies have shown that if those vessels are moving slower, if that propeller is not turning as much, it's not generating as many bubbles, that vessel is going to be quieter. And NOAA has done quite a bit of cool studies, actually. They actually tagged southern resident killer whales with little suction cup tags. And so it wasn't hypothetical. They were actually measuring levels of sound perceived by the whales' bodies themselves. And what they found is that it was the speed of the vessel, not the size of the vessel, not necessarily the distance of the vessel to the whale, but the speed of the vessel that most impacts how much sound that vessel is generating. And so you can have a massive ship very close to whales going very slowly that can be quieter than a small vessel far away moving quite fast. So speed is really the key indicator of how much sound is going to be generated near these animals. And so we have these threats. We know what these whales are struggling with. So what are we doing about it, and what can you do about it? So I want to talk a little bit about taking action, since it is Orca Action Month. So Washington just launched a brand new website that is really great, orca.wa.gov. I think they're going to put the link in the chat as well. But it's just such a helpful tool because there are so many different projects going on. There's so much pending legislation, and it's hard to keep track of all of that on your own. And so this new website allows you to go click on that button that says progress, and you can see the status of all these different projects that the state is working on right now in the hopes of southern resident recovery. There are lots of other samples on this website. I just picked a few to talk about here. When it comes to prey, one of the things that they are doing is increasing investment in salmon and forage fish habitat. So that directly relates to Skagit fisheries enhancement type work. So getting back some of that natural habitat that these fish need to spawn. There's also been an increase in hatchery production. That's a bit of a controversial issue. Obviously, the goal in the end is to have wild salmon restored, but we do need a Band-Aid in the midst. And so there is salmon hatchery projects going on right now to get some hatchery salmon into the water. Reducing salmon bycatch, that's a really important one, making sure that no salmon are being caught accidentally when they shouldn't be. And then I put this one in bold because it's something that does potentially affect our Pacific Whale Watch Association operators directly, which is that the state is currently investigating whether or not to manage pinnipeds. And that means potentially killing, allowing lethal removal of pinnipeds. And the idea behind that is that pinnipeds, or seals and sea lions, might be competing for the same resources as the southern residents. Pinnipeds eat salmon, southern residents eat salmon. So maybe we need to get rid of some of these seals and sea lions so that there will be more salmon for the southern residents, is the thought. We have two big concerns about that. One is we talked about those big killer whales that rely on the seals and sea lions. They didn't come here during the era of hunting seals and sea lions back before 1972 because there wasn't as much food for them. It's only now that those populations have recovered that they have moved back into the area. And so we would really hate to see any type of wide or broad removal of their prey items because then you might end up with two types of orcas that have a food shortage, right? So we want to avoid that. The other thing about removing seals and sea lions is that when you look at what they eat, if you look at their scat samples, which is the fancy scientific way of saying their poop, they have found that yes, seals and sea lions do eat salmon, but it's a very small percentage, maybe 3% or so Chinook salmon. Much more of their diet, more than 20%, are predatory fish that eat salmon. And so again, one of our concerns is if you're removing seals and sea lions in the hope that you'll remove salmon predators, well, if those seals and sea lions actually eat a lot of salmon predators, you could be increasing the number of salmon predators with that removal. So this is an ongoing process. Washington State Academy of Science is looking into it. We have been actively involved in that process, just making sure that the whales have a voice. But that's definitely a hot topic to keep an eye on in the coming months, possibly years. As far as pollution goes, some of the things that the state is doing is identifying priority chemicals that are most hazardous to southern resident killer whales. There was some really great work recently that found that tire runoff, basically, when that gets into the water, was killing off coho salmon. So they're really trying to address that threat. Southern residents, while they prefer Chinook, do definitely also eat coho. Increased monitoring of toxic substances in marine waters is on the docket, as well as reducing stormwater threats. and accelerating cleanup of toxicants that we know are already harmful to the orcas in the water. So they're working on that stuff under the pollution department. And then as far as disturbance goes, I have 2 items in bold here that directly affect us as whale watchers. There's new speed and distance restrictions, which I'll talk in detail about here in just a moment. But those apply also to regular vessels. So the hope is that all boats will kind of behave accordingly around southern resident killer whales. There's a new program called Quiet Sound in the area that is working to quiet large vessel traffic. So, tankers, shipping vessels. It's modeled off of and will be working in conjunction with the ECHO program, which is up in Vancouver. So kind of based on that. Increased enforcement for vessel regulations. A rule is only as good as its enforcement, right? So we have all these rules in place, but we need to make sure that they're actually being followed. So WDFW is working on being out on the water more often and increasing their resources. And then one of the measures that came out of the governor's task force a couple of years ago was creating a commercial whale watching license program, which I'll also talk about here coming up in just a moment. So as far as general whale regulations in the Salish Sea, they do differ just a bit depending on what side of the border you're on. So it's important to know both because the whales don't recognize borders. They move freely across from BC into Washington. Here in Washington, there is a federal recommendation that you stay at least 100 yards, so 1 football field's length from most whale species. So gray whales, minke whales, humpback whales stay about 100 yards away. There's a federal rule for Biggs killer whales to stay about 200 yards away. And that's not necessarily because the Biggs killer whales need it, but when that rule was made, the average boater that's out there doesn't necessarily know the difference between a Biggs killer whale and a southern resident killer whale from a distance. And so that federal rule for this region just gave Biggs killer whales a little bit of an extra buffer with the idea that that would give all killer whales and by default southern resident killer whales more space too. In 2019, however, the state did kind of ramp it up a bit more. They increased the distance to 300 yards for southern residents and 400 yards in front of or behind. So when you're viewing whales, any type of whale, you really want to stay parallel to them. You don't want to cut them off. You don't want to be behind them, stay on the side. So 300 yards from either side. And then the most, I think, powerful new bit of legislation also went into effect in 2019, and that is the 7-knot speed limit within a half nautical mile of southern resident killer whales. I mentioned that it is speed that has the most bearing on how much sound is being generated underwater. So when you are in the proximity of southern resident killer whales, we really want vessels to be going slowly. And there are other populations of whales around the country that are threatened or endangered. None of them have had any luck in making a mandatory speed limit in their vicinity. So it's really pretty progressive that Washington did. I do hope that other places might be able to do something similar. Canada's talking about it, but they have not done it yet. But I think that even more than the distance restrictions is what really will ultimately make a difference as long as vessels are following that rule. Now in British Columbia, very similar, 100 meters from most whale species, 200 meters if they have a calf with them. So that's something that's a little bit different that they have in Canada. And for them, kind of the same idea. So it's 400 meters from all orcas in the Salish Sea, with the idea being that, if you are out there as a recreational boater, you probably don't know the difference if you're just seeing an orca in the distance. And so just as a precaution to protect southern residents, they made the rule of 400 meters for all orcas in hopes that vessels would stay about 400 meters away. Now, professional whale watchers, because we can tell the difference, we have cameras, we have binoculars, we have naturalists on board. We were given an opportunity to view other types of orcas, so Biggs killer whales, northern residents, from 200 meters if we promised not to view southern resident killer whales. So it was a bit of a bargain, and most operators did take Canada up on that offer. If you've ever been whale watching, 400 meters is quite far. So, it's not necessarily that whale watchers believe that, they should not view southern resident killer whales. I'll talk about that here in a bit. It's more that we really wanted to view Biggs from 200 to have viable businesses. So we did take Canada up on that offer, and we're glad that they made that exemption for us. So here in Washington, the commercial whale watching license is brand new. It just went into effect January 2021. So this is our first kind of foray into whale watch licensing, and it's the second full year that we'll have of this program. Any vessel that takes customers to view marine mammals in Washington, so not just southern resident killer whales, but porpoises, harbor seals, any type of whale, that vessel needs to be licensed in the state of Washington. So that is new. And license holders can only view southern resident killer whales from that 300-yard distance during very limited windows. Those are during the months of July, August, and September, and only during the hours of 10 to 12 or 3 to 5, but not both. So if you see them in the morning, you can't watch them in the afternoon. During all of the other months and times, professional whale watchers cannot approach within half nautical mile, which is more than 1,000 yards, so 10 football fields. So realistically, most of the year, we are not approaching southern resident killer whales closer than a half nautical mile. If we are in one of those approved viewing windows, we can have no more than 3 licensed vessels at a time. And another part that the state wrote in is that we are not able to approach any whales that are pregnant, any calves under the age of 1, or any whales that are deemed to be vulnerable if they're sick or underweight or things like that. So it's a pretty restrictive whale watching license. It is new. We're coming up on July 1st here on Friday. So that will kind of start the 3 months of viewing. But just to give you an idea of how infrequently we are actually viewing southern resident killer whales, I wanted to help you visualize that. During the task force, there was a big push to completely ban the viewing of southern resident killer whales. And we fought pretty hard against that, and they did kind of make this concession. But the truth is, the licensing program pretty much does ban viewing southern resident killer whales under most exceptions. Last year, we viewed them 1 day in July, 1 day in August, and there were 15 days in September. Some of them were half days. But when you add up all of those viewing windows, it's no more than 60 hours out of the entire year. So we're really not viewing them very often. And so the next question that we typically get is, well, if you're only viewing them 60 hours, why don't you just volunteer not to view them at all? It'd be so easy. And that's a fair question, but it's something that we feel really passionately about. And that's that these restrictions that I just covered apply only to professional whale watch vessels. They don't apply to recreational vessels. They don't apply to ferries. They don't apply to commercial shipping vessels. And those are the vessels that are generating the most underwater sound and disturbance for these whales. There was a study that came out in 2017 that kind of analyzed how much underwater sound came from various sources. And whale watch vessels generated 0.6% of the underwater sound in this region. But when you combine ferries and tankers and tugs, it was about 93% of the underwater sound. In fact, ferries alone were nearly 67%, both BC ferries and Washington State ferries. So those vessels are still around these whales. And even if we can only be around them for 60 hours, in those 60 hours, that is when we are working closely with those vessels to make sure that they too are slowing down so that it's quiet for the whales. We call those types of actions sentinel actions. You probably heard us talking about this a lot in the recent months. But basically, the PWA considers a sentinel action any protective intervention that we perform during a tour to help wildlife. And some examples could be, stopping other vessels from coming too close. If we see a vessel speeding toward a whale, we'll blast our horn or we'll wave that whale warning flag. Proactive warnings, that's a big part of it too. If we're out there and we see a ship coming a mile away, we'll let them know, hey, there's a whale ahead of you. And usually they are very accommodating. Some of the non-vessel related things include removing debris. So if we find fishing gear out there that's derelict, that could be a risk. So we remove things like that. And also reporting entanglements or injuries to authorities. Those are some other sentinel actions. So these are things we do on a daily basis. And last year, we decided to start keeping track just to see, since this licensing system had gone into place. And we recorded in 2021 nearly 900 sentinel actions, 750 of which were related to other vessels. And I'm happy to say that last year we were able to successfully change the behavior of those boats in at least 70% of encounters. So 70% of the time, we were able to make sure that other boats in the area slowed down and avoided whales, therefore making it quieter and safer for them. And that's really important because while enforcement does have more resources, they still can't be everywhere at once. This is a huge geographic location. And a lot of times there might only be 1 or 2 boats out there as far as enforcement goes. So during our whale encounters last year, enforcement was present less than 3% of the time. So very often we're the only line of defense that those whales have. And so even if it's only for 60 hours with Southern residents, as long as we can, we're definitely going to try to do our part and make sure that we're warning other boaters. This is not just lip service from the Pacific Whale Watch Association. Some others have independently observed this. Orca Behavior Institute last year from their vessels as well as from shore kind of observed those sentinel actions and found that we were successful in changing that behavior at least 65% of the time, which is very close to our 70%. So that's good that those numbers are similar. And not only do we contact other vessels actively, but we do, just by being there and flying that flag, help alert boats that there are probably whales nearby and kind of help model those appropriate behaviors. And so what Orca Behavior Institute found last year is that when whale watch boats are absent, there were about 6.6 dangerous incidents near whales every single hour. If there was a whale watch boat there, that number dropped to 2.6 per hour. So decreased by more than half just by being there. And so again, yes, there's a potential for a bit of possible underwater disturbance from a whale watch boat, but if we're able to slow down all those other boats in the area, there is a net positive. And so that's our position. And that's what we as whale watchers are doing to address that disturbance issue. Now, as far as things that you can do to help Southern residents at home, these are things that apply whether you live here in the Salish Sea or live, in the middle of Oklahoma, right? These help whales, but also help all wildlife in general. Easy one, reduce your carbon footprint. Bike to work, carpool, take public transportation, walk when you can. It's so simple, but this is what we really need to all be doing for many, many reasons. But as I mentioned, salmon are not doing well because the waters are getting too warm, they can't spawn. And so we really need to get that global warming under control. So that's one way to do it, reduce your carbon footprint. Eat sustainable seafood. This is a really big one. If you do eat seafood, it's very important to know exactly what you're eating and where it came from, as well as how it was caught. We're fortunate here in Washington that we're pretty close to the source. So I always recommend, if you can, find a local fish market as opposed to, going to your big box store. Ask questions, ask to make sure that the fish you're buying is in season and that it was caught responsibly and things like that. Those are questions that we really have gotten away from asking, but it's important to know that the seafood you're eating was caught in a responsible way that didn't accidentally catch other types of fish in the process. I won't get into it too much here, but we do not recommend farmed fish. So wild caught fish, but make sure it is a sustainable type of fish. And then using eco-friendly cleaning projects, this helps with the pollution issue, whether we're talking about, cleaning products you use in your home that go down the drain, or pesticides that you use outside, or herbicides that would, eventually end up in the water sources. Just make sure that you're using non-toxic chemicals, natural cleaners, natural herbicides, things like that. We really want to make sure we're not dumping anything hazardous into our waters. And then restoring habitat. This is a picture from Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. This can be done in a few ways, planting trees, that helps with the carbon issue, but it also helps with the habitat issue, giving these fish places to spawn, providing shade on those streams so that the water is cooler. This is such a no-brainer. One of the great things about habitat restoration projects is they're not controversial, right? People fight about dams, people fight about fishing, people fight about vessel regulations. It's really hard to fight over planting a tree, right? So it's something that everyone should be able to embrace and support. And in my opinion, after being involved in this sphere for a really long time, it's probably going to give us the biggest bang for our buck as far as conservation investment. So definitely get involved in some restoration. And these are some organizations that I do recommend you get involved with, whether you want to get your hands dirty and do some volunteer work with restoration projects, or if you want to get your hands dirty in a different way by getting involved in, advocacy and writing congressmen and things like that. These are some of the organizations that I recommend. There are lots and lots of other recommendations. I don't have enough space to do them all, so I'm sorry if I left you out, but these are kind of some of the big ones here. Orca Behavior Institute and Center for Whale Research, as far as researching the animals go. Whale Scout is really great for conservation projects. Plus, they have a website called podmatch.org. You can type in your zip code and it'll let you know about beach cleanups and tree plantings and things like that near you. Orca Network is great for whale sightings. So you can share those and they share with researchers to help monitor whale behavior. Orca Conservancy does tons of advocacy work. Wild Orca, if you've ever seen Eba, the poop sniffing dog, she works for Wild Orca and they're out there learning more about our local whales. Salish Sea School does a lot of great educational stuff. And of course, Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. Again, so much money has been thrown at this issue. And I think that small organizations like these really stretch the dollar the most. And so I really, really advocate for donating either your time or your money or both to these grassroots organizations so that you know you're getting the most bang for your buck. This is my email address. I know we do have time for questions now. If anyone has a sensitive question they don't want to ask publicly, this is my email. I'm an open book. Yeah, looking at the clock, it looks like we have plenty of time for questions, which is one of my favorite parts. So I'll go ahead and kind of turn things over and then we'll get started with questions.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, Erin, thank you so much for sharing with us. I learned a lot and I hope you all did as well. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, okay, so now I'm going to pass it on to our outreach manager, Lucy DeGrace, who will moderate the Q&A portion of this presentation. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat if you haven't already.
All right, so there are a couple of questions in here already, and just keep them coming if you have some more questions. Erin, the first question is from Eric Young. He says, thank you and the industry's efforts with the Sentinel program. Is there coordination between the Washington and BC governments that regulate their fleets with respect to adopting measures to protect whales?
Yes, and so I will just say, I know that this organization is based in Washington, so I talked a lot about Washington stuff this evening, but BC is doing a lot of parallel measures on their side of the border. It's no surprise, so I can say it and hopefully not offend too many people. There's not as much communication across the border as we would really like. Those whale regulations are very confusing. They're very complex and it's difficult because, as I said, boaters are allowed to cross that border freely, whales cross that border freely, and having to know two different sets of regulations is a little bit challenging. So I know that the goal that they're working toward is more consistency. I think it just remains to be seen which set they'll kind of, gravitate towards and so on and so forth. So we definitely want more collaboration. We're working on it, but there's a lot of challenges right now as far as cross-border consistency for sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. Next question is the population of bigs of 370 just for the Salish Sea, or is that for their whole range?
Oh, good question. And so I do just want to be clear that these whales come and go. So there's not 370, bigs killer whales in Salish Sea. They're moving around. So that number 370 is whales that regularly visit us. And then there are others that are, infrequent visitors. There's several others that we see maybe once every couple of years or something like that. But about 370 as far as whales that regularly come and go throughout the area.
I had a mute because of a barking dog. Sorry. The next question asks, what about breaching the Snake River dams? Just to take it a step further.
Yeah, like I said, some things like habitat restoration are non-controversial, and things like breaching the dams are very controversial. And there's been a lot of people fighting for a really long time to remove those dams, and there's a lot of support for it, I would say, but there is also a very valid argument of the challenges of doing it. One little bit of progress that came out recently is that they actually, for the first time, very seriously did an economic analysis of what removing those dams would mean and how much money would basically be needed to compensate the folks that lose those dams and rely on them and things like that. So I will very humbly say that I am not a fish person. I'm not a dam expert, so I have not read that report carefully. There may be people on this Zoom actually that are way more knowledgeable on that than me. But it's definitely a discussion that continues to go. I feel like it gets a little bit closer, but still a super hot topic. And I don't think there's a general, I think it would be a very long time before there's a general consensus to take that action.
Okay. What was the effect of the trapping of southern resident killer whales near Penn Cove many years ago for public display in commercial ventures? Many of these whales were females, the brood stock for the population future.
Yeah, so not just the Penn Cove. I mean, that was certainly one of the more prominent instances, but there were many capture events. And I was just talking about this today. They basically took an entire generation, right? So they wanted the smallest whales because those were the ones easiest to transport. And so they took the smallest animals, leaving, older animals that might have been either very close to not being, reproductive or already past their reproductive stage, and left very few of those young animals. And so, gosh, yeah, I mean, you lost about 30 years of time as far as generations go. So it stinks because that is probably one of the most significant reasons that these whales are in the situation that they're in, and there's nothing we can do to go back and fix that, right? So it's just a heartbreaker, but it is, I think, at least a very valid thing to remember, because we are not capturing whales anymore here in the United States. But there are still some countries, and I won't get political or anything, but there are still countries that are capturing wild animals for public display. And so it's really important that you not condone that practice, do research when you travel abroad. Just really don't support that, because we saw what it did here. And I'd really like to make sure that we never see that happen anywhere else.
Okay. Can you comment on kayaks being close to whales?
Yeah, so that's a great question. First of all, when we talk about vessels having to stay that distance, it does also include non-motorized vessels. So sailboats, paddle boards, which are popular now, kayaks, those distance rules also apply. As far as commercial kayaks, like tours, they actually also have to be licensed. Their rules are a little bit different. But if you are a kayak tour in Washington that goes out and sees marine mammals, again, even if it's just seals and sea lions for the most part, you also have to be licensed. Kayaks obviously don't make much sound underwater. I am a kayaker. And one thing that I personally think, after, again, both living here as well as in Southern California, is a lot of kayakers believe that since they're not making as much noise, they feel like they can get closer. And that's, still potentially disturbing to the animals. And so just a great reminder that those distance regulations do also apply to kayaks.
Okay. What are the credible or reputable organizations on Vancouver Island?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they can clarify. I'm not sure if they mean whale watching or like conservation organizations, or not sure. Dawn, type
Dawn,
and see.
Yeah, Dawn, did you mean whale watching? Or just unmute yourself? Conservation, thanks. That's what she says.
Conservation, thanks. Yeah. So Vancouver Island. North Vancouver Island has a really great group called the Marine Education and Research Society, MERS. We work a lot with them on especially humpback whale things, but they're really champions as far as raising awareness about vessel disturbance and ship strike and entanglement and things like that. As far as like other conservation organizations, nothing's coming to mind right now. Like I said, Center for Whale Research, a lot of the organizations that I mentioned do transboundary work. So, you know, Center for Whale Research has researchers from Canada and Washington.
All right. Another question from Eric Young. I know killer whales are matrilineal. Does the pod tend to follow the oldest female? And if so, does that mean their ability to find food depends on that female?
Oh, good. So there have been some cool studies that have come out lately to kind of show. So for those that don't know, killer whales are one of the very few mammals apart from humans that undergo menopause. And so in the animal kingdom, for a lot of animals, you're only useful as long as you can reproduce. And then once you can't reproduce anymore, you die. But animals that undergo menopause tend to live on for many, many years after they stop reproducing. And killer whales are one of those species. And there's not a rule that it necessarily has to be the oldest female, but those older females, you know, the aunts, the cousins, the moms, the grandmas, they are considered to have all of that knowledge. And so, you know, they know the best hunting spots, they know the seasons of where to go and when, and they do kind of lead the way. And studies have shown, and again, there's people on this call that know more of this than me, but there have studies that show that if a mother passes away, for example, her son has a much higher chance of dying in the next few years after mom passes, because it is believed that they hold so much importance in that group. Yeah, the females really, really do have a lot of influence on the success of the family for sure.
Interesting. All right. Has there been much known interaction with fishing gear?
Oh, so hi, Dick. I know him. With orcas, not as much as with other types of whales. So for whales like humpback whales and gray whales and blue whales, entanglement is much more prevalent of an issue. We don't see it as often with killer whales, but it definitely does happen. There have been some killer whale entanglements. We do see some of our local killer whales getting into trouble. So there's a few families that really love playing with crab pots. They love pulling those buoys around and playing with them. And sometimes they might get caught up a little bit. But we're fortunate that there haven't been too many actual entanglement incidents that I know of orcas, but I definitely know there have been a few, but it is not as much of an issue as it is with those larger, slower moving whales like humpbacks and gray whales. Oh, Joy Primrose just said there's an entangled killer whale found off of Oregon yesterday, so I'll definitely have to look into that. Yeah, it's definitely possible. Like I said, not as frequent by far, but certainly I'm aware that there have been instances.
Well, there's a lot of praise for your presentation. That was really interesting. And I learned a lot from your presentation. If anybody else has questions, I don't see any more in the chat, but if anyone else has any questions, feel free to, you're welcome to unmute yourself and show yourself on your camera and just ask if you would like to do it that way instead of typing it in. Either way, I think is fine. Going once. I'm very appreciative of your presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you everyone for joining. I know at least if you live in this area, it's 1,000,000 degrees in our homes right now. So I appreciate you dedicating time to come listen to me. I'm sweltering here at home. So I really do appreciate the sacrifice.
Yeah,
sure.
literally 1,000,000 degrees.
Global warming is real, everyone. If you weren't,
at least today.
believe it now.
Well, thanks for the questions, everyone. They're really good. And then we have some announcements before we go. But first, I would just like to say, Erin, it was an absolute pleasure to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and, just for helping spread awareness for Orca Action Month. So we also, even though we're nearing the end of June, I encourage you all to stay Orca aware by visiting PacificWhaleWatchAssociation.com, which should be posted in the chat, to learn more about these fascinating marine mammals, the threats they face, and what you can do to help. So like I said, we have just a couple of announcements before we wrap up. There's good news for anyone looking for employment in the environmental field. Skagit Fisheries is currently seeking qualified candidates to fill 3 different positions, which are the AmeriCorps Education Associate, which involves assisting with environmental education activities related to salmon habitat enhancement, the Riparian Restoration Project Manager, responsible for planning and implementing all of SFEG's riparian restoration projects, and the Seasonal Restoration Technician, which is tasked with performing manual labor to implement riparian habitat restoration projects throughout the Skagit and Salish River watersheds. So application links for those should be posted in the chat now. But if you're more interested in volunteering, we are also hosting volunteer work parties over the next couple months at Bowman Bay in Deception Pass State Park, where we'll be doing some beach restoration and maintenance. We held the most recent work party earlier today, but we'll be there again on July 13th and August 8th. And the links to register for those will be posted in the chat as well. So I believe that covers everything. Erin, thank you again so much for the fantastic presentation. Also, many thanks to Megan and Lucy for keeping everything running smoothly. And of course, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you all have a great night. So I'll stick around.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I'll stick around in
you.
the chat a little bit in case anybody has any more questions or wants to copy the chat or anything like that.